Hello and welcome. Today we are going to read Flat Stanley. This was one of my favourite books when I was a kid. It's a very silly book. Okay. Oh, late breakfast in the USA. Enjoy your late breakfast with your Flat Stanley story. Okay, are we ready? Hey, come and look, Arthur Lambchop called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop cared greatly for politeness and correct speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, Mrs. Lambchop said. But look, Arthur said, pointing. Across Stanley's bed lay his enormous bulletin board. It had fallen on Stanley during the night. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed, but Stanley wasn't hurt. What's going on here? He said cheerfully, sitting up. Heavens, cried Mrs. Lambchop. Gosh, said Arthur, Stanley's flat. As a pancake, said Mr. Lambchop. Darndest thing I've ever seen. There's Stanley, look. See how flat he is? Mrs. Lambchop sighed and said, Let's all have breakfast, then we'll hear what Dr. Dan has to say. Do you think they should have breakfast, or do you think they should sort Stanley out first? In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley. How do you feel? He asked. I felt sort of tickly after I got up, Stanley said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. The nurses took Stanley's measurement. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. Look at how flat he is. Being flat could be fun. Stanley enjoyed going in and out of rooms by sliding through the crack at the bottom of the door. Arthur tried too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could be exciting. During the holidays, Stanley was invited to visit his friend Thomas in California. Mr. Lambchop brought home an enormous brown paper envelope and said, Stanley, try this on for size. The envelope fitted Stanley very well, and the next morning his parents slid him into it, along with an egg salad sandwich, and posted him from the postbox on the corner. Can you imagine going on holiday in an envelope? I don't think that would be very comfortable, would it? Very silly. Stanley had a fine time in California. Look, he's being a surfboard. Oh dear. Thomas's family returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. They marked it airmail and wrote, Valuable, this end up, on both sides. He looks very happy in his Hawaiian shirt, doesn't he? In the park one Sunday afternoon, Stanley and Arthur watched some boys flying big kites. Someday, Arthur said, I would like to have a big kite. You can fly me, Arthur, Stanley said. Come on. He gave Arthur the spool and attached the strings to his arms. Then he ran across the grass to catch the wind. Up, up, up went Stanley. Arthur let out all the string and Stanley soared high above the trees. Everyone stood still to watch. Makes a very fine kite, doesn't he? But Arthur got tired of running with the empty spool. Wedging it into the fork of a tree, he went off for a hot dog. He didn't notice when Stanley became tangled in the branches of the tree. Half an hour passed before Arthur heard Stanley's shouts and climbed up to set him free. Arthur apologised over and over again that evening, but Stanley was still cross. I think I should be cross too if I was stuck in a tree. Poor Stanley. The next morning, Stanley and Mr. Lambchop met their neighbour, Mr. O.J. Dart, director of the famous Museum of Art. Mr. Dart looked worried. Another valuable painting was stolen from the famous museum last night, he told Stanley and his father. The police suspect a gang of sneak thieves work at night by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. Stanley had an idea. He explained it to Mr. Dart. Excellent, said Mr. Dart. We'll try out your plan tonight. What do you think his plan might be? That evening, in the main hall of the museum, Mr. Dart showed Stanley the most expensive painting in the world. Next to it was an empty picture frame. And now, Stanley, said Mr. Dart, it's time for your disguise. Stanley showed Mr. Dart the disguise that he'd brought. That is a really good one. My cowboy hat and a red bandana. I'm sorry, Mr. Dart said, but we don't have any cowboy pictures here. You must wear the disguise I have chosen. Stanley could hardly speak when he saw Mr. Dart's disguise. I'll look like a girl, he said. But Stanley was a good sport, and he put it on. This is the disguise. Boys can wear dresses though, can't they? And they can have long hair. I think he looks fabulous. What do you think? In the main hall, Stanley climbed into the empty picture frame and stood very still. Very nice, said Mr. Dart, and went off to arrange the rest of their plan. Now Stanley was alone. The hall was very dark, but enough moonlight came through the windows for him to see the world's most expensive painting. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come through, he thought. Then, creak! A glow of yellow light shone suddenly in the centre of the hall. A trapdoor had opened in the floor. The sneak thieves, carrying lanterns, came up into the hall. Can you see the sneak thieves? The thieves took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. This is it, Max, said the first thief, whose name was Luther. In all of this great city, there is no one to suspect us. Then Luther saw Stanley in his frame. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max, he said. This one looks scared. Stanley managed a tiny smile. She is smiling, sort of, Max said. What a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley furious. In his loudest voice he shouted, Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here! There's the sneak thieves. Terrible people. Max, Luther whispered, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest, Max whispered back. You'll get a rest all right, shouted Mr. Dart, running in with lots of policemen. You'll get arrested, that's what. The sneak thieves were quickly handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, Stanley Lambchop got a medal from the chief of police. The day after that, his picture was in all of the newspapers. There are the burglars being taken away. Hooray for Stanley. For a while, Stanley was famous. People would point him out and whisper, Over there, Agnes, Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the museum robbers, and things like that. But then people began to make fun of him. Hi, super skinny, they would all call. He doesn't look very happy anymore, does he? Poor Stanley. Late one night, Arthur woke to the sound of Stanley crying. What's wrong? He said. Stanley sighed. I want to be a regular shape again, like the other people. It's not fair. You're brave, Arthur said. You really are. And then Arthur had an idea. He turned on the light, ran to the big toy box in the corner. He tossed aside toy soldiers, aeroplanes and boat models. Got it, he said, holding up an old bicycle pump. That's a clever idea, isn't it? OK, Stanley said after a moment, but take it easy. He stood with the end of the hose in his mouth, clamping his lips tightly so no air could escape. Arthur began to pump. If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand, he said. Stanley's top half began to swell. Stanley got bigger and bigger. His pyjama buttons burst off. Wow, look at that. Soon he was all rounded out, except for his right foot. He shook the foot twice, and it swelled to match the other one. There stood Stanley Lambchop, as if he'd never been flat at all. Thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you very much. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop came in to see what the boys were up to so late at night. George, said Mrs. Lambchop, Stanley's round again. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Mrs. Lambchop made a hot chocolate to celebrate, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop took the brothers back into bed and turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," Stanley and Arthur said. Very soon, the Lambchops were all sound asleep. There they are with their hot chocolates, with marshmallows in. And there's Stanley's pinboard. Do you think you'd like to be as Flat Stanley? I think it might be fun for a short while, but I think the novelty might wear off quite quickly. I'm pretty sure actually there's lots of different versions now of Flat Stanley, and he goes on lots of different adventures. Thank you for joining me for Flat Stanley, and I will see you again tomorrow. Bye.